Sophie walked through the city streets, the hum of traffic and the chatter of people around her barely registering as she made her way home. It had been a long, exhausting day at the office. Her presentation had gone well, better than expected, but none of that seemed to matter now. All that mattered was what waited for her at home. Or, rather, what didn't. As Sophie opened the door to their apartment, the familiar scent of the place hit her, but it was different now, stale, suffocating. She didn't need to turn the corner to know Mark was sitting on the couch. She could feel his presence, heavy and oppressive. He didn't even look up as she walked in, his eyes glued to his phone. Sophie exhaled, trying to steady her breath. She could already feel the tension building in the pit of her stomach. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Mark didn't respond, still absorbed in whatever was on his phone. Sophie set down her bag and made her way to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it was there, lurking under the surface. She knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. A few moments passed before Mark finally looked up, his eyes scanning her like she was a piece of furniture he'd forgotten to acknowledge. "You look tired," he said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. Sophie didn't know how to respond. She wasn't tired. She was frustrated. And she was angry. So angry. She'd spent so many months feeling small, feeling like she wasn't good enough. He had made her feel that way. Mark had a way of belittling everything she did, every achievement, every step she took. He always made it clear that he was the reason for her success, that without him, she was nothing. "You didn't come to my presentation today," she said, her voice gaining a bit more edge. "I told you how important it was to me." Mark's lips curled into a cynical smile as he shrugged. "I didn't think it was a big deal. It's just work, Sophie. You've got plenty of time to worry about that. And besides, if it wasn't for me helping you get that job, you wouldn't even be where you are." Her stomach twisted. There it was again, his constant need to remind her that she was only successful because of him. That without him, she was just some ordinary girl with no future. She set the glass down with a little more force than necessary. "I didn't ask for your help. I earned that position on my own." Mark leaned back on the couch, his gaze never leaving her. "Don't kid yourself. You wouldn't have gotten far without me. Everyone knows that." Sophie's heart sank. How had it come to this? Every time she thought she could make it on her own, Mark was there, reminding her that she was nothing without him. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself, trying to win his approval. And for what? To feel like a shadow in her own life. The words she had been holding back for months bubbled to the surface, finally breaking free. "I'm done," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "I can't do this anymore, Mark. I can't keep living in your shadow. I need more than this. I need more than you." Mark's eyes hardened, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "What are you talking about? You can't just walk away from this, Sophie. We've been together for 2 years. You don't get to throw all that away." "I'm not throwing anything away," she replied, her hands trembling now. "I'm choosing me. I'm choosing a life where I'm not constantly undermined, where I'm not constantly made to feel like I'm not enough. I can't keep pretending that I'm happy when I'm not." Mark stood up abruptly, anger flashing across his face. "You think you can do better than me? You think you'll be fine without me? You'll never make it without me, Sophie." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the words hit her. But this time, she didn't flinch. This time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to be afraid anymore. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I don't need you. I don't need anyone who makes me feel small. I've been strong enough to get this far on my own, and I'll keep going. Without you." The silence between them was deafening. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie didn't let him. She grabbed her things from the counter and walked toward the door. Her mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. But the one thing she knew for sure was that this was the right decision. It was time to take control of her life, to step out from under the weight of his constant criticism and manipulation. "Where are you going?" Mark called after her, his voice rising. "I'm leaving," she said, not looking back as she stepped out the door. Sophie stepped into the night air, the cool breeze against her skin a welcome change. Her hands were shaking, her chest tight, but she felt something she hadn't felt in so long: relief. It was over. The relationship she had been trying to hold together for so long, the relationship that had drained her, was finally over. And for the first time in months, Sophie felt free. She wasn't defined by Mark's cruel words or his control over her. She was her own person, and it was time she started living like it. Sophie didn't think she would run into Mark so soon. But then again, New York City was small in its own way. The cafe she had chosen was one of her favorites, a quiet, cozy place tucked away on a side street. She'd been there countless times, sipping her coffee and reading in peace. Today, it was supposed to be just another ordinary day. But as she walked in, she felt the presence of a shadow looming. It didn't take long for her to spot him. Mark. Standing in the corner, talking animatedly to a group of people, his voice booming louder than the rest. His posture exuded that same arrogance she had gotten used to over the years. When he noticed her, he froze for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before the look in his eyes darkened. Sophie felt a jolt of tension ripple through her. She tried to ignore him, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. She moved toward the counter, ordering a cappuccino, trying to steady her nerves. But it didn't take long before Mark sauntered over, his presence taking over the space like a storm. "Sophie," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "I see you're doing well for yourself. You look relaxed." Sophie turned to face him, feeling a wave of annoyance sweep over her. She didn't want to get into this again, not here, not now. But there he was, standing in front of her as if nothing had changed. As if their relationship hadn't just ended in flames. She forced a smile, her lips tight. "I'm doing fine, Mark," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just enjoying my coffee." He chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. There was a sneer in his voice that Sophie instantly recognized. He wasn't here for a casual chat, he was here to prove something. To her, to everyone around them. "You think you can just walk away like everything's fine?" Mark continued, his voice rising slightly, drawing attention from a few people nearby. "You really think you're something special now that we're done? You're nothing without me, Sophie." Sophie's jaw tightened. She had expected this, Mark's need to tear her down when he didn't get his way. It was his MO, to make her feel small, even when he was the one who had lost control. But now, it wasn't going to work. "I've told you before, Mark," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not nothing without you. I never was." Mark laughed again, but this time it was more mockingly than before. He stepped closer, his presence invading her space, his eyes cold and calculating. "You really think you've got it all figured out, huh?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can just go on and pretend that I wasn't the one who made you who you are?" Sophie felt her chest tighten. Every word he said was like a slap, a reminder of the years he'd spent controlling her, making her believe that she was only worthy because of him. She was tired of it. She was tired of being defined by him. "I'm not pretending, Mark," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm living my life, for the first time, on my terms. And you have no say in that anymore." Mark's expression darkened. He stepped even closer, practically looming over her now. Sophie could feel the heat of his breath as he spoke. "I'm not done with you, Sophie," he hissed. "You don't get to walk away from me like this. I can destroy you, you know that, right? You really think you'll succeed without me?" The words cut deep, but Sophie held her ground. She had been afraid of him for far too long. She had let his words define her, let his cruelty shape her reality. But not anymore. Before she could speak again, Mark made a move. With no warning, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face, the sound of the impact ringing out in the quiet cafe. Sophie froze. The world seemed to stop in that instant. The other patrons of the cafe turned their heads, eyes wide with shock. Her cheek burned from the blow, and for a split second, she felt the old rush of helplessness. But then, something inside of her snapped. Mark stood there, smug and victorious, expecting her to break down, to cry, to run away like she used to. But this time, Sophie wasn't the same person. This time, she had nothing left to lose. She slowly turned her head, letting the sting of the slap settle for just a moment, then met his eyes, her own burning with an intensity he had never seen before. For the first time in years, Sophie felt a surge of power. With no hesitation, she raised her hand and slapped Mark back with everything she had. The force of the blow sent him stumbling back, his eyes wide with disbelief. The room was silent. The once bustling cafe now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something more to happen. Sophie stood tall, her heart pounding, but she was calm. She felt the weight of years of manipulation, of control, of being belittled, all fade away in that single moment. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this cafe. "You don't get to treat me like that anymore," Sophie said, her voice low but full of conviction. "You think you can hit me, put me down, and I'll just take it? You're wrong. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Mark stood frozen for a moment, the shock of Sophie's retaliation settling in. His face was a mixture of anger and surprise, his hands clenched into fists, but Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Without another word, Sophie turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. As the door swung closed behind her, the whispers started. People began to talk, the tension in the cafe slowly lifting. But Sophie didn't care about the whispers. She didn't care about Mark, or what anyone thought. She had taken control of her own life, her own narrative. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like true freedom. The following weeks passed in a blur for Sophie. After the confrontation at the cafe, she found herself walking with her head held higher, feeling a new kind of strength coursing through her. For the first time in years, she was finally free from the suffocating hold Mark had on her. But even though she had made the decision to walk away, the reality of what that meant was still settling in. Sophie spent the days focusing on herself, on rebuilding her life. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, some of whom offered support while others, surprisingly, sided with Mark. It didn't matter anymore. Sophie had made the decision to sever ties, to not just leave Mark but to leave behind everything that had held her back. The career, the confidence, the life she had built, everything that had been tangled with his presence, was now hers to reshape. One afternoon, as Sophie was finishing a project for her new marketing firm, she received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but something about the urgency in the voice on the other end caught her attention. "Miss Sutton," the voice said. "This is James Walker from Walker & Company. I believe you know Mark Lawrence." Sophie's pulse quickened. She knew exactly who James Walker was. He was a major player in the financial world, someone who could make or break companies. She had no idea why he was calling, but she wasn't about to let the conversation go unanswered. "Yes, I know Mark," Sophie replied cautiously. "Why do you ask?" "Well," James said with a tone of regret, "it's come to our attention that Mark has been making some questionable decisions recently. I wanted to inform you that his company is facing some significant financial troubles. In fact, if you're interested, there's an opportunity here. We've been looking to make an acquisition, and Mark's company is now on the verge of a deal that could bring them under new ownership. I think you might want to look into it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing: Mark had made a grave mistake underestimating her. She had heard whispers about his company's troubles over the past few months, but to think it had come to this was another matter entirely. And now, there was an opportunity to turn this situation around, not just for herself, but in a way that could truly send a message to Mark. James continued, "I believe you have the resources to make a move. We have access to all the financial data, and we can help you purchase controlling shares. It's your chance to take over the company and put yourself in a position of power. I can put you in touch with our legal team if you're interested." Sophie leaned back in her chair, thinking for a moment. The temptation was undeniable. Here was her chance, not just to succeed, but to seize control of everything Mark had once been so arrogant about. Sophie had always dreamed of running her own company, but this was more than just about business. This was about power. And, she realized, it was also about revenge. She was going to take it all: the company, the control, the freedom. And she was going to make sure Mark knew exactly who had beaten him at his own game. A few weeks later, the deal was done. Sophie had worked tirelessly with James's team, poring over documents, building her position, and leveraging her skills as a marketing professional to restructure the company's brand and operations. It hadn't been easy, but the reward was worth it. She was now the largest shareholder of the company Mark had once run, and she had taken the reins. It was time to make her move. The day of the takeover, Sophie arrived at the corporate office. The building that once felt intimidating now seemed small, almost insignificant, as she'd entered the boardroom. Mark had no idea what was coming. He had been kept in the dark, unable to see what was about to hit him. The room was filled with the upper management, all of whom had worked closely with Mark for years. As Sophie walked in, there was a brief moment of silence. She had not been at the company for long, but her presence was undeniable. Everyone knew her reputation now. She was no longer the woman they had written off as Mark's girlfriend, or the weak link. She was the woman who had bought their company, the woman who had taken control. Mark, however, seemed unfazed at first. He stood up, his usual arrogant smirk plastered on his face. Well, if it isn't Miss Sutton," he said, a hint of disdain in his voice. "Did you really think you could come in here and take over everything I built? You must be delusional." Sophie didn't flinch. She had heard his taunts for years, but now, they didn't matter. She took a seat at the head of the table, a confident smile forming on her lips. "I'm not delusional, Mark," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I've been doing the work you were too blind to see. I know what this company needs, and I'm here to make sure it gets there. You, however, have a choice to make. You can either stay on as an advisor, if you can stomach that, or you can leave. I'm not here to destroy what you built, but I am here to lead. And I don't need your approval." The room went silent. Mark's face paled as he realized what was happening. His arrogance melted away, replaced by the dawning realization that he had lost. He had lost it all. "Do you honestly think you can run this company better than I ever could?" Mark's voice wavered now, the bravado gone. "You're nothing without me. You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for me." Sophie stood up, her gaze unwavering. "I'm here because I worked for it, Mark. I didn't rely on anyone to get me to this point. And that's the difference between you and me. You were always looking for someone to hold up your ego. But I'm not here to prop you up anymore. I'm here to take what's mine." Mark stood in stunned silence as Sophie walked toward the door. "I'll give you some time to gather your things," she added, her tone final. But don't take too long. I'm not waiting for anyone. As she walked out of the boardroom, Sophie could feel the weight of the moment. She had done it. She had taken back control, and in doing so, had shown Mark exactly what she was capable of. The taste of victory was sweet, sweeter than anything she had ever imagined. The days following the takeover were a whirlwind for Sophie. Her life had changed so drastically in such a short period. From being emotionally manipulated by Mark to now being the head of the very company he once controlled, the shift was unimaginable. Yet, it felt incredibly right. It was a validation of everything she had worked for and fought through. Sophie moved quickly, establishing her leadership in the company. She immediately implemented changes, breathing new life into operations, revitalizing the marketing strategies, and restructuring the internal culture. She surrounded herself with people who believed in her vision, making the company stronger and more cohesive. She had proven to herself that she was capable of leading, no longer defined by her past, but by her own merits. But as the company continued to thrive under Sophie's leadership, Mark's world was collapsing around him. The once confident businessman who had built his empire on arrogance and manipulation was now struggling to pick up the pieces of a broken career. The company that had been his pride was now under the control of the woman he had belittled for so long. Sophie had outsmarted him, outplayed him, and left him in the dust. Mark, who had always believed he was untouchable, now found himself sitting in his lavish apartment, his thoughts consumed by the failure of everything he had built. His calls to the board members went unanswered. His contacts in the business world turned their backs on him. And worst of all, his pride had been shattered by Sophie's success. It wasn't long before Mark realized how far he had fallen. He had been ousted from his own company, his own empire, by a woman he had once considered beneath him. The pain of his downfall was unbearable, and he could feel his anger boiling inside him. He had underestimated Sophie in every way, never once believing she could be a threat. Now, he was living with the consequences of that mistake. He spent his days sulking in his apartment, drinking away the sting of defeat. His phone sat on the table in front of him, its constant buzzing a reminder that things had changed. Every message was a reminder of his irrelevance now. But then, late one night, the phone rang again. He didn't recognize the number, but something inside him told him it was important. His hand hesitated before picking it up, as if his subconscious was warning him. But he answered anyway, his voice bitter. "Mark Lawrence," he said. "Sophie Sutton," came the voice on the other end. Her tone was calm, collected, and without any trace of the vulnerability he had once been able to manipulate. "We need to talk." For a moment, Mark was silent. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from Sophie since the takeover. The shock of her leaving him, then buying out the company he had built, had left him stunned. He had always been the one in control. And now, here she was again, calling him as if nothing had changed. "Talk." Mark spat, his anger bubbling up. "What do you want? You've already taken everything from me." Sophie's voice remained even, unshaken. "I just wanted to make sure you understand what's happened here, Mark. You didn't lose your company because you were a bad businessman. You lost because you underestimated me. You thought I was weak, and that's the mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." Mark gritted his teeth, fury rising within him. He had always been able to control the narrative, but now, Sophie was turning everything back on him. "You think I don't know that?" he growled. "You think I haven't been sitting here, thinking about how I let you slip through my fingers? You're the reason I lost everything, Sophie." Sophie's voice was unyielding. "No, Mark. You lost because you couldn't see beyond your own arrogance. You thought I was just the woman behind the scenes. But now, I'm the one calling the shots. You're the one left in the dust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark's chest tightened, his hands trembling with the weight of his humiliation. He had always been in control, always the one who held the power. But Sophie had taken it all from him, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with desperation. "You don't have to do this, Sophie. You don't have to leave me like this. We can start over. You can come back, we can rebuild together." Sophie was silent for a moment, the silence stretching on between them like a weight. Then, she spoke softly but decisively. "No, Mark. You had your chance. You blew it. I won't go back to that. I won't go back to being controlled, to being small. I've worked too hard for too long to get where I am now, and I'm not going to let you tear that down." The words hit Mark like a slap, and he felt his knees weaken. He had never imagined it would come to this. He thought he could always control Sophie. But she was beyond his reach now, far beyond anything he had ever expected. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he whispered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I was wrong." But Sophie didn't hear him. She had already hung up the phone. Mark spent the next few days in a fog, replaying the conversation in his mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The thought of losing Sophie was one thing, but losing his entire empire because of his own arrogance was something entirely different. He had lost everything, his company, his self-respect, his dignity, and now, he was left with nothing. One day, he decided to show up at Sophie's office, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for reconciliation. He had tried to avoid the truth for so long, but now, as he stood in front of the sleek, glass building that housed the company he had once owned, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He was broken. Sophie's assistant, a young woman who had quickly grown fond of Sophie's leadership style, greeted Mark at the front desk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lawrence," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Miss Sutton is unavailable at the moment. Is there something I can help you with?" Mark's face twisted in frustration, but he forced a smile. "No, it's fine. Just tell her I stopped by. I just need to talk to her." The assistant nodded, but it was clear that she wasn't interested in passing along his message. Mark had been replaced, and he was no longer seen as someone with influence. Sophie's team was loyal to her now, and he was just another casualty of his own hubris. He left the building, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his failure hanging over him like a storm cloud. He had been warned. People had tried to tell him that he couldn't control everything, that he couldn't keep manipulating Sophie. But he hadn't listened. And now, he was left with nothing but his regrets. Sophie stood at her office window, looking out over the city as the sun began to dip behind the skyline. The lights of the city were starting to twinkle below her, but she wasn't paying attention to the view. Her mind was elsewhere, wrapped in thoughts of how much her life had changed in such a short time. The Sophie who had walked into that cafe months ago, unsure of her own worth, felt like a completely different person now. She had fought for everything she had, not just her career but her very sense of self. She had taken control of her life, and the confidence she had gained from that decision radiated through every aspect of her being. She was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be diminished, manipulated, or controlled. She was a woman who had found her strength and embraced it, unapologetically. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her reverie. Sophie picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was another message from Mark. It had been weeks since the last time he tried to reach her. After their final conversation, he had stopped sending messages for a while, but now the floodgates were open again. It was always the same: pleas for forgiveness, apologies that felt hollow, and desperate requests to meet. She couldn't help but let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Mark was still trying to claw his way back into her life, but Sophie had long since closed that door. She swiped the message away, feeling a surge of satisfaction. She wasn't going to let him pull her back into his world of manipulation. Not again. She had made her choice, and she was committed to it. It wasn't just about letting go of him, it was about letting go of the life he had tried to dictate for her. As she turned back to her desk, she thought about the future. The company was thriving under her leadership. Her team was more motivated than ever, the work culture had shifted from one of fear to one of collaboration and innovation, and her new marketing campaigns had increased sales in a way Mark's old approach never had. But beyond the financial success and the career victories, Sophie felt a deeper sense of accomplishment. She had proved to herself that she didn't need anyone to validate her. She had always been capable, and now she had the power to shape her own path. But it wasn't just about professional success. It was personal too. Sophie had rediscovered a life outside of work, one that didn't revolve around trying to prove anything to anyone. She had rekindled friendships she had neglected while she had been with Mark, and she was finally making time for the things she had put on the back burner for far too long. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living for herself. Despite his increasing desperation, Mark couldn't seem to let go. The corporate world had turned its back on him. People who once praised his achievements now whispered behind his back. No one would hire him. The doors had slammed shut, and now he was left alone in his penthouse apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had once taken for granted. Mark hadn't been able to accept defeat. After everything, after all his manipulation, Sophie was the one who had risen from the ashes, and he was the one left in ruins. His pride gnawed at him, and the rage simmered inside him every time he thought about Sophie walking away from him. She had taken the company, she had humiliated him, and she had left him with nothing. He needed her back. It wasn't just for the company, though that was certainly part of it. It was about proving to himself that he still had control. That he could win. Mark had tried everything. He had gone to mutual friends, sent numerous emails, and even visited her office once, but Sophie was steadfast in her refusal to engage. It didn't matter how many apologies he sent, how many times he begged, Sophie had moved on. She was done with him. The final straw came when Mark showed up uninvited at one of Sophie's charity events. The gala was one of the most anticipated events of the year, a celebration of the company's latest success under Sophie's leadership. Mark stood at the back of the room, watching as Sophie mingled with guests, looking more confident, more alive than he had ever seen her. He couldn't stand it. He found his way to her, slipping through the crowd, and finally cornering her by the coat check. Sophie turned, startled at first, but when she saw who it was, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here, Mark?" she asked, her voice cool and distant. "I had to see you," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. About what I did." Sophie shook her head, her eyes narrowed with disbelief. "It's too late for apologies, Mark. You had your chance, and you blew it. I'm not the person I was when we were together." Mark's expression faltered, the weight of her words hitting him hard. He had wanted her back, but he didn't know how to fix the damage he had caused. There was no going back. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't live like this. I need you. I was wrong." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her heart conflicted for a brief second. But then she remembered everything, the manipulation, the control, the way he had tried to break her down. She had learned and grown too much to go back to that. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not sorry for what happened. But I'm sorry that you're still stuck in the past. I've moved on." With that, Sophie turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The following weeks were a blur of progress for Sophie. She was no longer weighed down by the remnants of her past with Mark. The company continued to grow, and so did she, personally and professionally. She was stronger than she had ever been. Sophie stood in front of a mirror one afternoon, looking at herself with a new kind of confidence. She had gotten used to this new version of herself, but it still felt strange sometimes, like a dream. She had reclaimed everything that was once taken from her: her independence, her strength, and most importantly, her sense of self. She glanced at her phone again, but this time, there were no more messages from Mark. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely free. Sophie knew that the future was hers to shape now. She had earned every success, every step of progress, and she was going to keep pushing forward, taking risks, and living her life on her own terms. There were no limits to what she could achieve. And she didn't need anyone's approval to make her feel valid. Her life was hers to command.